I'll turn over the time to Chuck now. Please welcome Chuck Cox and speaker.
Thank you. Thank you, Don. I really appreciate it. One of the things that I got involved in several years ago, 2008, 2009, I wound up spending a year in Australia working with a major utility company there. And one of the things that we discovered was it's very difficult in a very set-in-place culture to get improvement if you don't really look fundamentally at the existing processes, using the people in those processes and their perspectives. Not necessarily the perspective of a quality professional, not necessarily a lean professional's perspective, but the people in the process that have been there forever, their perspective, and having the tools necessary to capture their perspective and get it agreed to by the rest of the people in the organization. It was a culture that had been around for a very long period of time. A utility company, classic utility company culture in which the people knew what they had to do. They had to make sure that the people had electricity 24/7. It was very straightforward. And the particular utility company happened to be in the state of Western Australia. If you're not familiar with the state of Western Australia, it is 31% of the landmass of Australia. When I talk to my friends from Texas and they talk to me how about how big the state is, I cite the state of Western Australia, and they pipe down pretty quickly. These people had a government-owned utility. Does anybody see the beginnings of a culture here? We've got government and utility stacked one on top of the other. And they were experiencing unbelievable growth. As you probably know, the mineral wealth of the state of Western Australia is unbelievable. Natural gas, iron ore, chromium, you name it, they've got it. And they're trying to pull it out and ship it to China as fast as they can. So new mines were coming up, and they were also in a situation where if you were more than 3 years out of engineering school working for the utility, the mining companies would be more than happy to come along and double your salary, and you would go on a 10-10 program. 10 days in at the mine, 10 days home, doing whatever you wanted to do for those 10 days. Okay? So there was only the people who were there for 3 years and the people who were 5 years away from retirement. There was nothing in between. Do you see an argument for maybe standard work on those processes that may not be very well known by the people who just graduated from engineering school? And you've got all that knowledge walking out the door in 5 years or less. What are we going to do? Well, you're going to hire a bunch of people from the United States to come down and help you out. Well, it turned out that the normal way of doing value stream mapping wasn't working very well. We were having a really, really rough time. So it was at that point in time we moved into the world of not just Kaizens, but enterprise-wide Kaizens, and a couple of fundamental tools that I had used individually in the past, but had never used in combination before. Teams of 2 and IDEF Sub-Zero. So we're going to go through that at a level that I'm hoping at the end you'll be able to see how we did it and maybe even see some merit for doing it yourself the next time you want to do a value stream map. Okay? So starting from the top, the Six Sigma Way. How many people are familiar with this book, Six Sigma Way? Pete Pandy and his, okay? If you look on page 33, you'll see somebody by the name of Chuck Cox, some relationship to me. He says there probably should be a rule of thumb, redesign your major processes, I'm talking about your core processes, redesign your major processes every 5 years. And you're thinking, my God, that's a lot of work. Yes, but you need to do it. So wouldn't it be nice to understand how to do it and to do it not only quickly, but easily and accurately? What I'm going to talk about tonight is exactly that. A series of tools that will help you do quickly and accurately value stream mapping, and you can do it enterprise-wide from the very beginning to the very end of that particular thing in your organization, whatever it is you're doing. Core processes now. We're not talking about, human resources. We're not talking about the IT guys. We're talking about your core process. The processes for which your organization is known, and it is a primary reason for their existence. That's what we're talking about here. Okay? So everybody probably knows Michael Porter's value chain model. You talk about the primary value chain right here. We're talking about inbound logistics, and then your operations, your outbound logistics. This is all about fulfilling the demand. Over here, you're going to generate demand from your marketing guys and your service people. Okay? We're talking about working on end-to-end, from your inbound logistics all the way to your service, that process. We're talking about an enterprise-wide process. Okay? We're going to do a value stream map on that. So that's what we're talking about. The most important thing is core processes and enterprise focus. We're not talking about some minor thing over here that's a good thing to do, but isn't really that important in the grand scheme of things. We're talking about something that's truly important to the existence, the preeminence of that company's operation. Okay? Voice of the customer and voice of the business. We're talking about identifying, with respect to your voice of the customer, your most important market segments, your most important customers, and gathering the voice of the customer segment by segment, and then moving on to the voice of the business and clearly understand your business strategy. I can't tell you the number of times we get into these kinds of programs where we're about improving, and in the first or second meeting with the people, I say, now, I would like somebody to explain to me the company's strategy and how it impacts this operation that we're about to engage in. 99% of the time, you can see the eyes glaze over as you look at the people in the room. Why? They don't know what the company's strategy is. They don't understand how what they're doing needs to be aligned with the company's strategy. So this is part and parcel of that. How do you include the voice of the business, the strategy, and the policies of the company? Down here at the bottom, depending on what kind of business you're in, the voice of regulatory. A state government-owned electrical utility. Do you think they had a VOR? In spades. But not every company has that, okay? QFD. How many people are familiar with quality function deployment? Okay? So here's a book written by a couple of guys, including me, and we talk about the voice of the customer driving the design. And we talk also about the voice of the business focusing on what adds value from the business's perspective. So we're trying to balance both. We're trying to be preeminent in our customer segment's value stream, their value stream, not ours, as well as serve the business's goals, strategies. So that's what we're talking about. So when we talk about process characterization, anytime we talk about process characterization, it behooves us to take into account the most knowledgeable people from the process. Get them involved in this. They know far, far more than this, even the supervisors of the process. They know what's going on in the process. They not only can tell you what's going on in the process, they can tell you the workaround. And you know that workaround? Oh, by the way, under certain circumstances, it has another workaround. And every once in a while, on a rare occasion, there's a third workaround that happens. Does that surprise you? It shouldn't. But you will be surprised if you use traditional value stream mapping exercises to get the value stream map. You will probably be less inclined to be surprised when you're using teams of two and IDEF sub-zero approach. That's where we're going with this. You want to engage the people most impacted by any changes, because once you make the change, you'd like there to be a prayer of a hope that it's going to be sustained. If you do not get the people who are in the process and are going to be impacted by the change engaged early, your risk of this thing bouncing back to its old ways is very high. It's very high. So we want people who gather the information, who are inside the process, and we want the information that they gather, these teams of two and the IDEF sub-zero charts that we're talking about over here, we'll get to that in just a minute, we want the review people to also be from that group. So typically you have one person who's a spokesperson for the team of two, and they take and review everything that they have discovered. We usually give them 2 weeks to do this, and they review this with 4 or 5 people also from the process. The spokesperson does. Now, you may have 25 or 30 people in that process, but you only have a small review group and an even smaller one-person spokesman for the team of two. And we'll get into a little more detail later, but just to give you a sense of how you do this. You need a format and an environment that fosters rich discussions. It's not about it's right or it's wrong. It's just about what is. What is the as is? No judgment. Absolutely no judgment. All we're trying to do is to find out, okay, we're trying to map this thing. We're trying to find out just exactly what goes on. And it's absolutely, totally judgment-free. Absolutely, totally judgment-free. So you got to have a structure. It can't be about the people pointing fingers at each other. It's got to be about everybody discovering what the process really is. And then last, we want to link the information together and show a thread so that we can review for waste. Show a thread. You're going to have inputs coming up here. You're going to have outputs going down there. These outputs serve as the inputs for the next one over. These outputs serve as the inputs for the next one over. And the reason why the yarn is there is because it shows that sometimes they're not in the same order as they go up there. Don't care. Just as long as you can show that thread of information as it moves through the entire process. Remember, this is an enterprise-wide process. It may be a very, very long process. So you've got to show that thread, and everybody has to agree on it. So a key concept, first concept, we're going to have 3, is cycles of learning. The first cycle of learning talks about individually characterizing sub-processes inside the enterprise-wide process. Donna, when she introduced me, she talked about chunking. Typically, when I use my conversation with people who are actually doing this, I talk about chunking. But everybody understands sub-processes. So we're talking about breaking this thing into natural chunks and calling out a sub-process and assigning a team of 2 to that sub-process. And what do they wind up with? When they're done, they'll have one of these things filled in. So each one is a chunk. Each one is a sub-process. So in this instance, we've only got 3 sub-processes for the entire enterprise-wide process. Not very likely, right? We can agree on that, I think. Cycle of learning number 2 is to link all the sub-processes in their sequential downstream order. So we're going to link these 3, and we're going to start here. And this is the first step, or the first sub-process in a sequence. This is the second sub-process in a sequence. And this is the third sub-process in a sequence, and we're moving downstream, moving from left to right. We'll get to the cycle of learning. We're talking, first, let me back up. Create the output-input thread. Does everybody see? We got pieces of yarn that go from these outputs to these inputs. Okay, so that's the output-input thread. And over here, output-input thread. So we have information that runs all the way through the enterprise. Then we'll get to cycle learning number 3. We're going to review the voice of the customer and the voice of the business, a separate entity, stop everything, forget everything we've just done for the last 3 or 4 hours, if you're going to do one of these things in a day. Go to lunch. When you come back from lunch, you talk about only the voice of the customer and the voice of the business. Sometimes it's good to introduce the various segments of customers and the various pieces of the business strategy before you go to lunch so they can talk about it during lunch. But when you come back, all you're focused on is voice of the customer, voice of the business. That's it. And you come to an agreement on which things are the most important for this process to deliver with respect to the customer. and which things are the most important for this process to deliver with respect to the business. And we write them down. We have a flip chart, and very often we have 2 or 3 flip charts full of all kinds of information input from the people. Once we agree this is what the process is supposed to be delivering, then we move into our 3rd cycle of learning. And we start at the process's endpoint. We start down here. And we say, okay, if this process is supposed to be delivering this output, great. How about a situation where you've got an output, this one right here, and there's no voice of the customer demand for that output? And there's no voice of the business reason for that output, but you still have it. In the lean world, what's that called? It's called waste. Exactly right. Exactly right. So we start moving upstream. We go from here to here, and we are identifying waste as we go. These black lines on the way up, some of them turn into red lines. Some of them turn into yellow lines. Yellow means it's business non-value added. We have to hang on to it for a while until we can revise things. The red one is non-value add. We can get rid of it right now, if not sooner. Okay, so those are the 3 cycles of learning that you have. You do the cycle of learning about the sub-processes. You really understand each one of these sub-processes very well. Then you move into going downstream, 1, 2, 3. And then, after you understand what the process is supposed to be delivering, you go upstream. So let's talk a little bit more about the details of that. Teams of 2, key concept. Remember, 3 key concepts. 3 key concepts. What's the first one? Cycles of learning. Number 2 is teams of 2. Only 2 people. You're looking for a special kind of 2 people. 2 individuals with differing perspectives. Long or short tenure. One person is a technical person, one person is a very non-technical person. Okay? You want somebody perhaps that's only been here a year and a half, and another one's been around for 25. Do you think they look at that process a lot differently? You bet. The one that's only been there 18 months is constantly wondering, why the hell do they do this? It doesn't make any sense. The 25-year-old tenure person says, well, we've always done it that way, and about 10 years ago we had a failure, and because of that failure we put this little step into the process. And that failure's never happened again. They never drilled down to understand the root cause of the failure in the first place. You don't know if they put the right step in or they didn't. Yes?
Would it be advantageous to do a team of 3, have 2, one senior and one non-senior, and then bring the secretary out front to ask, why the hell do you guys do it?
I have found that 3 is one person too many. You're getting the benefit of having done this sort of stuff for the last, actually 30 plus years is a lot closer to 45. So I'm not saying it's not a great idea and you can try it and it might work, but my experience with 3 people as opposed to 2, you're better off with 2. Don't forget, we have a 4 or 5 person review of what the 2 teams of 2 do.
No, agree, but even after that, having someone with absolutely no experience questioning the process and why things are done a certain way to bring to light.
If you've got a process, and we'll look at an example of a process that's pretty straightforward, that might be beneficial. But the fact of the matter is, most of us, when we look at an enterprise-wide process, there's a level of complexity there that you simply have to have some more than minimal knowledge of what's going on. And I'm not downplaying the importance of secretaries, because very often they're very important, but they may not have the technical background to ask the right questions. So, at any rate, you can evaluate the members, the teams of 2, the potential teams of 2 members. You can look at the Bilbin, or you can look at DISC. One of the things you need to understand is different people may need different kinds of support. So be looking for that. You talk about the sponsor, the champion, the financial representative, liaison with the IT guys, you know, because those IT guys, they speak another language. And sometimes even when we're talking to them in what we think is pretty straightforward English, they're hearing something altogether different. So you need a guy who can speak both languages, a translator, and then, or a master black belt. Okay? Then, provisions for training before the information gathering proceeds. They need to understand how to fill this form in, if nothing else, right? And we need to understand metrics, because one of the things you do, these black lines, these pieces of yarn that join the output to the input, this might be per day. This might be per load. This might be per 8-hour shift. This might be per week. These things have got, all the metrics have to agree. Not because it would be world-shattering if they didn't agree, but you've got to have that rich discussion. Remember I talked about you have to foster rich discussion. And you'll never get any richer a discussion than when you start talking about the metrics between these guys, this sub-process output, and these guys, this sub-process input. Okay? That's the kind of rich discussion you want to foster. And metrics are important. We all know metrics are important, but agreement on the metrics between the two adjacent sub-processes, that's very important. Okay? So we talk about that. And they're going to need some coaching and mentoring before, during, and afterwards. So we need to put all that in place. Okay? Key concept number 3. I thought we'd never get there. Everything up until this point has been about the soft skills side. Have you noticed that? Now, as quality professionals, we would sooner, most of us, ignore the soft skills side. Okay? And when I graduated from Purdue a few years ago, I thought I pretty much had it knocked. I really knew everything. I mean, you know, pretty well-known university, and they teach you pretty well. And, you know, you walk into your first job. My first job, by the way, was a technical advisor in India for small and medium-scale industry. I was about 3 months into it when it became apparent to me, very apparent to me, that what I knew from the engineering side of things didn't cover it all. Didn't even come close. Because there's a whole bunch of assumptions that are just automatically made. You just don't think twice about them. They may not hold true if you're operating in a different culture, and every company is a different culture. Every organization is a different culture. So you have to be very careful about these assumptions. All right. IDEF format. That's just the format. It's just the structure. But oh my, is it a great structure. If you truly want to characterize what's going on, you need to know, sure, the inputs, the activity going on, and the outputs. That's standard operating procedure. Everybody has a flow chart that looks like that. What's different? Well, it's talking about the guidelines and control, the governance. How do these guys change the inputs into the outputs? What are the rules? And what's the mechanisms down here? Now, if you go look at your IDEF Sub-Zero books, and I've got 2 of them down here, the one if you really want to get a handle on this one only costs about 20 bucks. I think it's out of print, but you can buy them used, 20 bucks from Amazon, good old Amazon. Don't read the front, read the 2 case studies in the back. Okay? Then, if you really get excited about IDEF and you really want to know about it, all about it, get this book. A little bit more expensive. It's also out of print, I think, but I found a used one for 71 bucks. And you can too, if you're really into that. So all of the citations I've given you, they're on the last slide, and they're in your handout. It's the last page in your handout. So it's the mechanism that comes up from the bottom. Now, IDEF will tell you, you need all these mechanisms. Cox's version of IDEF says, no, you don't, because you don't have enough time to do this with all the mechanisms. You need the constrained mechanisms only. Believe me, you only need the constrained ones, okay? So go down that path. It'll get you where you want to go faster, and you will not increase your risk 1 iota. That's been my experience, okay? So does everybody understand what's going on here? Inputs, activity, outputs. The governance of how you're going to change the inputs to outputs is coming from here, And all the mechanisms necessary for doing this are down here. All the mechanisms? The constrained mechanisms. Only the constrained mechanisms. You don't need all. So here's what it looks like. Elements impacting an activity. In this case, we're going to do some brownie baking, just so you get a gist of this thing, okay? So the activity is bake brownies. The inputs are these ingredients and pan grease. What's your output? Well, ready to serve brownies. I'm salivating already. I love brownies. And a messy cook area. Remember, the stuff that comes out oftentimes is accompanied by stuff you don't want. And you have to take into account the stuff you want along with the stuff you don't want. Okay? Messy cook area is an example of that. Well, what are the things that are going to give us some guidance on how to do this? Well, a recipe. So the recipe tells us how to convert these inputs to that output, those outputs. And oh, by the way, what are the mechanisms? Well, we got an oven and cookware. All that stuff goes into it. So there's an example for you, something you're probably fairly familiar with. Right? Here is the form, and I've given you a blank one. You can take the activity, and you can take this large activity and break it down into the smaller tasks that go into the activity, if you want. Okay? This is more of an industrial version of the brownie cooking. So we're talking about materials of all kinds, consumables of all kinds. Over here we've got the outputs, what the customer wants, and the byproducts from the process. Byproducts can be good, but some are toxic. So you have to watch for that. Guidelines, information of all kinds, and then down here all of the constrained resources. Okay? So, learning cycle number 1, all about sub-processes. Get the teams of 2 and get them trained. Gather the information using IDEF Sub-Zero. Have a review group, 4 or 5 people from the same area that you got the teams of 2. Have them review, update the information, and create an IDEF Sub-Zero poster. A poster that looks just like that. Very often has a whole mess of Post-it notes on it. You can write on it if you want to. If you really are that sure that everybody's going to agree, I suggest Post-it notes first go around. Okay? And then identified concerns are recorded, usually on a flip chart. And usually 2 or 3 or 4 flip charts are not unusual for one of these. Okay? Lots of information comes out. It's not the job at that moment in time to go through and say which of the information is more important than which of the other information. That's not what we're concerned about. We're just concerned about getting all this stuff up and recorded. That's the most important thing. There's nothing that is bad information. Anything we can get out of this process is good information. We can figure out later if it's important or it's not important. Right now we're after information of all kinds. Now we start the cycle of learning going downstream. So a process review group, not to be confused with the sub-process review group. So a process review group, this will be drawn from people who know these 3 processes. Okay? They may actually only know this process and half of that process, and another one knows half of that process and this process. But it's a different group. Not totally different. There may be some overlaps. Teams of 2 bring the updated IDEF Sub-Zero posters to the Rapid Improvement event, and they're arranged to show the entire enterprise process all the way from the beginning to the end. Follow the process downstream using the posters and the output-input threads. Get an agreement on the metrics between these different sub-processes from here to here and from here to here. Identify and record any concerns. Okay? Now we go upstream. Once you have the processes, customer segments, and the associated voice of the customer, review the voice of the business. When you've got both of those, you're writing down the voice of the customer elements and the voice of the business on a poster, typically something flip chart. And you should be able to get it on one flip chart. Sometimes it's 2, maybe, but never 3. Confirm the agreement on metrics between the sub-processes. It's one of the easiest ways to get a really rich discussion about what's going on in the process. Then you start at the end of the process, go upstream, you're linking the voice of the customer and voice of the business to that last poster's output, and then using the output-input threads, you're constantly going upstream, 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 and you're recording the waste and concerns on flip charts. Okay? These are the references that I cited before, and they're in your handout. If you decide you want to go down this particular path, I can tell you that at the utility company, when myself and a couple of colleagues discovered that we weren't getting anywhere and we were 5 months through a 12-month engagement and we had to come up with something that would work for this very large, and I will say recalcitrant, electric utility company. In the past, I think most of you have heard when you're doing a Kaizen event, you should never have more than 7, at the very most 15 people in the room. Anybody heard something along those lines? 7 to 15. The first enterprise-wide value stream mapping exercise using this technique that we did, we had 65 people in a hotel ballroom. Did we feel really confident that this was going to work? Not no, but hell no. We were really worried because everybody told us you can't have more than 15 people in a Kaizen. Well, we had 65. And the senior leadership team was there and saw what we had found and the action list that we had generated on a core process, which had been a pain for them like forever, certainly for the last 5 years. And it wasn't getting any better, it was getting dramatically worse. The outputs, they loved. We got into an interesting conversation with them shortly after. We took 3.5 days to do this first one. And I'm not sure how they're very persuasive, and they said, there's another core process we must do. 3.5 weeks later, we did the second one, this time in a very, very large meeting room at the local casino, and we had 85 people in the room. And in both instances, we hit the ball out of the ballpark. So this works. It works under some rather difficult conditions. I'm not sure that it'll work at your place when you're doing value stream mapping, but if you were to adopt something of this nature, it would not be, I think, unusual for you to do a value stream map every 5 years on your core processes. Now, you probably only had 3 or 4, maybe 5 core processes. You wouldn't do all of them in 1 year. The first year you'd do one, second year you'd do the second one, third year you'd do the third one. At the utility company, we did their 2 most important core processes within a month. It wasn't necessarily planned that way. That's the way we did it. I'm just saying it might make more sense to do it on a staged basis over a longer period of time. What do you think? Good stuff? Bill?
So how were you actually able to get that many people engaged in that event? Do you have that many that would be experts or going across?
The situation was that we, the outside consultants, were charged with streamlining the organization, and we were using the standard approach of taking 1 or 2 areas that we thought had management which would be amenable, and we were making small changes in that to generate a model, and then showing people that inside their own organization they had the ability to change and to get better. And it was good for the people that were in the process, and it was good for the outside customers all at the same time. We had come up empty 3 times in a row, taking that approach. Typically, you would have a meeting with the team on Mondays or Tuesdays. There would be an agreed on these 4 things are going to be done. We would assign persons to do them, and you'd wander around to their office Thursday, and you'd say, hey, how you coming on whatever it is you're supposed to be working on? And the person would say, you know, in our conversations that we had at the team meeting on Monday, we didn't cover this. There was always an excuse. There was always a reason why they didn't start down the path that they needed to start down for this engagement, this particular project to be successful. So we had to take that information to the senior leadership team, and we said, if you will participate in this, we will do an enterprise-wide value stream map. And they said, okay, you think this is the best way to go? We said, we think it's the only way you're going to get this particular culture off the dime. And so the CEO shows up on a Monday morning. He gives his 15 minutes of blessing. Not only did the CEO there, but everybody in the C and their direct reports was there. So there were 15 people there. And then the same 15 people showed up after lunch on Wednesday when there was a whole series of suggestions for improvement, and they blessed them with the expectation that after lunch on Friday there'd be a report out, and all the action items would then be blessed by the senior leadership team. At that point in time, it became pretty obvious that nobody was going to come to us at Thursday in the afternoon, or we weren't going to wind up in their office saying, did you do anything? Because you had stood up before everybody in the organization that mattered in terms of the senior leadership team and their direct reports, and you had committed to doing this by that date. It worked. Senior leadership team was very pleased, and the people who were actually having to do the work, they understood how important it was, and they buckled down and they started to get the job done. And taking this approach, if we had had the idea sooner, we would have gotten the engagement done sooner. As it was, we barely got done in 12 months. But we were only committed to do it in 12 months. But you know, when your back's against the wall, you do stuff that you wouldn't ordinarily do because it has a high level of risk. But with an awful lot of planning, we were able to make it work. So, yeah. Any other questions?
Chuck, I'll ask you one. So
Yeah.
The first time that you're going to use this process, would you suggest picking an area where there's a big major area, major problem in the process, where you're going to try to work through and have a big impact? Or would you pick just an area where you need to tweak or just enhance a process?
I would go after, if you have a strategy, if your company has recently come up with a strategy that said, we're going to move full force into doing this, into accomplishing this, and you don't have a really detailed plan, and you don't have the people who are going to make this happen on board, I would suggest going and working on that core process that's going to be able to, if it's done well, execute that particular piece of the strategy. I would go that route. So it's a strategic issue. Anytime you work on a core process, it should be a strategic issue. And if where you are right now is not going to get you where you need to be from a strategy standpoint, you don't think you can execute on that particular piece of your strategy, then this is the technique that I would use. I wouldn't worry about nibbling around the edges. In this particular instance, we were nibbling around the edges and it wasn't getting us anywhere. So we had to really pull this all together and do it this way. So, great question. Yes, please.
What were the 2 enterprise processes that you were working on?
The first one had to do with, these guys were a monopoly. So they were in the distribution and transmission of electricity. And they were providing power to these new mines. And the new mines were not real close to any areas where they already had grid. So you were talking about putting in a new transmission line that was going to cost you multi-millions of dollars over some very rough terrain. One of the very first things was, how do we serve our how do we serve our industrial customers faster? Because they are putting millions of dollars into a mine. Okay, we're going to put in 1/10 of that amount of money in getting electricity to them. And when we first started, it was taking 10 meetings between our industrial customer and the utility to get this all sorted out. We were able to go through and streamline the process and get it down to 3 meetings. The initial meeting where they tell us what it is they need or what they think they need, okay? The preliminary of what the result of the utility company analysis is, and the final. And that chopped over half of the time out, over half the time. And everybody says, you'll never be able to do that. But it turned out that not only were we able to do it, we chopped 55% of the time the first go round in that first year, and subsequently I understand they've chopped another 15% off. So that was the very first one. The second one had to do with their, they have an awful lot of old infrastructure and in populated areas. So one of the things they have to do is they have to have a very well thought out, how are we going to replace this infrastructure? Piece by piece, like if a transformer on a pole goes bad, okay, you put a new transformer on it, okay? But gee, you'd like to be in a situation where you could guarantee the reliability of that particular piece of the grid a lot more than, other than a piece of lightning hitting a transformer, outside of that. But the transformer itself in normal operation going down. So they didn't have a streamlined process for doing that. They had a process. You could argue from the kind of breakdowns and outages they had that it was a broken process. It was not, they were not on the West Coast anywhere near as good as the guys on the East Coast were. Now the East Coast had been deregulated almost 4 years earlier than they had. So there was a lot of stuff that they could copy. But Western Australia, because it's so large and it's one company that covers the whole state, they have a different situation than the guys on the East Coast do. There's a multiple ones on the East Coast as opposed to the West Coast. So they couldn't copycat. They had to come up with something that made sense for them. So it was the replace the grid, update the grid, if you will, in the populated area, and it was the transmission lines to their industrial customers. Those are the two major ones they had to work on. Yeah. Any other questions? On a scale from 1 to 5, how many people think, with 5 being the most value, how many people would give what I just talked about, not necessarily me, but the conceptual framework I just talked about, would you give it a 1 or a 2? Show of hands. How many would give it a 1 or 2? Okay. Show of hands. How many would give it a 3 in terms of value? Okay. Show of hands. How many would give it a 4 in terms of value? Okay. And last, how many would give it a 5 in terms of value? Okay. Good. Well, it sounds like I spent a useful hour of my time and a useful hour of your time. Yes, please.
We could give parts of it a 5 maybe. So if I had a 5, it would be in the area of involving those workers that are doing the work to define the process.
Yeah.
And having them lead the way.
Yeah.
So I like it. Thanks.
Yeah. You've got to do that. And the issue today is sustainability, or lack thereof. We see all sorts of organizations making all sorts of changes, and then you come back in 2.5, 3 years, and you wonder if the change was ever made in the first place. Sustainability is directly related to how much engagement do the people doing the work when you made that change. Were they involved from the get-go, or was it imposed upon them after the fact? And it's a full spectrum here, okay? Your risk of lack of sustainability is very high if you wait until the last minute to engage people. The flip side, of course, is your risk of it being sustained is great if you engage them from the get-go, from the very, very beginning. So. Yes, please.
In your exercise, did it come across ever that people's personal goal, because you mentioned that a lot of them were ready to retire, 5 years, ready for retirement.
Yeah.
They have organization goals are different, they want to improve, they want to optimize everything versus these people, sometimes it's not matching it.
Yeah.
And it may or may not surface in this kind of discussion, Although, in their sublime mind, they partially want to defeat something like, that goes against that.
I've worked with several utilities here in the United States, and the mindset of the utility in Australia was very similar. Those guys will do anything, heroic actions, to keep the juice flowing. They really are bought into, I know what I do is important. I mean, their weaknesses in some of their grid was such that you would have a typhoon or you'd have a major weather event forecast, and they knew when it was going to hit landfall, and they knew that within an hour and a half to 2 hours after it hit landfall, it would go into a weak area of the grid. And this is Western Australia. So a guy would get in his company pickup truck, and he would drive 3.5 hours, and he would sleep in the cab until the weather came in. He didn't know exactly where it was going to break, but he knew it would break. And he knew that he would be within half an hour drive, and he could fix it in half an hour. So the total outage would be 1 hour. I mean, that's true dedication. And you had everybody thinking that way. That's the reason why the Aussies love the Yanks, because we're all a bunch of cowboys. Really, Standard work? What's that? I know what I'm doing. Don't you tell me what to do. I've been doing this for 35, 40 years. I'm just a few years away from retirement. I'll tell you who doesn't know what to do. It's these kids that are just out of college and they only got 2.5 years in. Who's going to teach them? So we were able to capture that piece of the culture at that company and would say, you're going to teach them, and here's how you're going to do it. So they were on board. No problem. None whatsoever. Once we kicked it loose, once they began to understand what we were about, we weren't about throwing people out of work, that's for sure, because they couldn't hire enough engineers. They couldn't hire enough technical people. So, great question. But I understand exactly where you're coming from, because I've been in those organizations too. Yes, please.
Are you going to make this available electronically?
I could. It's not a problem. If you don't follow LinkedIn articles, part 1 of this was published as a LinkedIn article, and here's the URL that you can use. Part 2 will be published this coming Tuesday. So it won't have all of this stuff, but if you want to give me a business card, I'll be more than happy to share with you the PowerPoint. You're probably going to have to go to a Dropbox or something like that, because this is a pretty large. I tried to ship it to Tanya, and I couldn't do it. So
we should be able to, if nothing else, put the links on our site.
yeah, okay, that'd be fine. Yeah, and you can go just look up Charles Chuck Cox at LinkedIn, and all the articles will be there. So this one here, you'll note the reason I put in this is because that's the funny looking header that's on the article. So all the arrows going every which way. So I saw another.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Question about the teams of 2.
Yeah.
And you kind of touched on this because you talked about the disparity between the old guy who's been there for 35, 40 years, is about to retire, knows everything, and the young person who doesn't know everything.
Right.
How do you get them to work together and not have the old guy be the one who dominates?
Well, what we said is the reason we got them in a room, and we specifically told them the reason you were chosen is because of this, and the reason you were chosen is because of this. And we know you're not going to see the world the same way. We don't expect you to see the world the same way. We will have made a bad choice if both of you don't give us your perspective. We want it on equal measure. The old guy and the new guy, so to speak. I hesitate to use those terms because I am an old guy now. So, but
I don't have it.
yeah, right. So, but we made it very clear that we were putting in place a process to capture the process as it truly is, not as somebody 5 years ago flowcharted it, okay? Not as if you were to sit down and do a flowchart but not capture all the workarounds. Because every time there's a workaround, that's a failure of the process. The process has not been designed correctly. It needs to be redesigned to deal with that so that you don't have this crazy workaround stuff. So, and believe me, at the utility company, they had workarounds on top of workarounds on top of workarounds. Oh my God. Did you have a question?
On the webmaster, and I was just gonna see how to put it on the web.
Ah, okay.
I'll put a link to your
Okay, great. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, please.
You had the power and the position to, instead of selecting two, I know you said 3 is too many. Instead of selecting 2 though, you could have picked 7 or 8, and you could have picked the right 7 or 8 that had the diversity. Why wouldn't you do that to get,
No.
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 I knew you were gonna say no, you already said no to 3.
No. Remember, what we're trying to do is we're trying to do this fairly quickly. My observation is you get 80% of what you're going to get with those 2. You get another 10% from the review technique. Remember we talked about one of the 2 people in the teams of 2 is going to be the leader and is going to go through this IDEF sub-0 chart with the review, the sub-process or the process review team, which might be 4 or 5 people. So those people are going to add 10%. 80% of this is going to be here. And you're never going to capture the other 10%. It's going to cost you an arm and a leg and 3 eyeballs to capture that last 10%. And it's not that important. It truly isn't. The most important stuff you're going to capture from the original plus review.
The 7 or 8 are end to end. It's the 2 plus 2 plus.
Oh, no. You're talking about the process review team. The process review team borrows from the sub-process review teams, plus you'll have 1 or 2 other additional people. Very often those additional people come from the IT guys, or they come from the finance guys. Because remember, every organization has a de facto evaluation program in place, always has.
I just wondered, I'm probably screwed up. I skipped the team of 2.
You skipped it?
Yeah.
Why?
Form that team with 8 people and 4 sub-processes are.
We're trying to get the job done quickly. We're trying to foster rich discussion, but we're not trying to get into your typical team thing where conflicts just automatically arise. We're after information. We're trying to reduce the possibilities of conflict as much as we possibly can, because we know that any time you get into conflict, all of a sudden information gets withheld. We don't want that. Okay? People are the major problem. Oh, by the way, people are the major solution. So we're stuck with them. So we need to figure it out. And I'm just telling you one way that works. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much. I appreciate your attention and your questions. Appreciate it.